Hello, brothers and sisters. It's Gary again from Unsealed. I wanted to do a quick addendum to my last video covering some of the comments and questions that arose from my timeline that I unpacked on the Shmita cycle. I just think that the Shmita cycle is really important. And from what we can tell historically, it really is either ending this year or next. So we are very close to the beginning of a new 7-year period. So the first thing is the passage in which we get the Shmita cycle from Scripture. So here in Exodus chapter 23, we read, "And for 6 years you sow your land and have gathered its increase, and in the 7th you release it and have left it, and the needy of your people have eaten, and the beast of the field eats their remainder. So you do to your vineyard and to your olive yard." And then immediately in verse 12, it goes right into the week. 6 days you do your work, and on the 7th day you rest. So I find that fascinating. There are many passages that talk about the days of the week, 6 days for work, 1 day for rest. And there are other passages that talk about the Shmita cycle, but in this passage, they're directly connected. One leads into the other. So I think that's important. And as we talked about in the last video, the weekly cycle is a dictate from God, and it's mentioned many times in Scripture. So I argue that perhaps the Shmita cycle is also an unbroken chain in history, and perhaps even more so than the Jubilee cycle. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But I wanted to just remind all of you guys regarding my timeline that I'm aware of my assumption going into it. And the other assumption that I'm making, of course, is that this year is the Shmita year, so that the modern Israeli reckoning is correct. And it seems to align historically with Shmita years after Christ and before Christ. However, there is actually debate about that. And there's some interpretation of the Seder Olam as well as Josephus, suggesting that the Shmita year is actually 1 year later than I have it on my calendar. So my calendar is based on the modern reckoning that's in use in Israel today. And it's based on the common interpretation of what the Seder Olam says, that the year before the Second Temple was destroyed was a Shmita year, and an interpretation of some commentary from Josephus. But I think when you put all those things together, everything aligns really beautifully. However, again, so just to be clear, the argument I'm making still fits pretty well with next year being the Shmita, or should I say this Tishri 1 starting the 7th year, so that the first year of the next cycle would actually begin in fall of 2023. So I think from what we see in the world, it sure seems like this could be it, and that we are on the verge. But for clarity's sake, my timeline kind of has the flexibility to work with either of those potential Shmita years, either this year or next. And if the modern reckoning is incorrect in Israel, and the Seder Olam should be interpreted as that the temple was destroyed during the Shmita year, then again, we're still really close. And a lot of the other connections that I've made still fit pretty well. And there's a few other connections that fit better. So I think that overall, there's a more compelling case that this year is the Shmita year, and we're about to start a new 7-year cycle. But for clarity's sake, if it's 1 more year, then things still fit very well. And either way, we're really close. So this is mind-boggling to me that we can know for certainty that the biblical Shmita year is either this year or next. So, you can let that sink in. I mean, we know that from history. It's one or the other. It's either this year or it's next. And in most of the other years we've looked at for the rapture or the beginning of the tribulation, they haven't fit this pattern. So if God is going to stick to this 7-year pattern that he's used in the past, like with the famine or the years of plenty in Joseph's day, and the pattern that we see in Jesus' time and the pattern that we see today, if he's going to stick with that 7-year pattern, then this really could be the strike zone. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is a comment that was dropped on my last video regarding a quotation from Josephus, where he says that around the time of Passover, the sun would be in Aries. Well, here I'm looking at the sky from April 2nd of this year, and I'm focused on the sun, and it's in Pisces. It's pretty far from Aries. It's in the wrong constellation. So is what Josephus said, is that how we should determine our calendar? And I'm seeing this crop up a lot in how people are reckoning the calendar. They're suggesting that our calendars today, whether it be the observed or whether it be the rabbinical, which are both really close for the most part, but it would suggest that both of those calendars are typically too early when they start the month. But I want to dispel this. This is not, it's not an accurate way to factor the calendar. And here's why. Because there's something called precession, where our view of the ecliptic, so the ecliptic being the path that the planets appear to travel around the sky, the ecliptic, it actually does appear to wobble a little bit over time. And it's called precession, and it affects our vantage point of the planets and the sun and so forth. So if we look at the sky here, looking from Jerusalem in early April of this year, you can see obviously that the sun is not in Aries yet. We still have another month to go. So if I put on date and time and I move forward 1 month, in early May, you can see that the sun is finally in Aries. Or, you could go back a few days and you can see it really was kind of like late April that the sun finally entered Aries. But that would indicate, if Josephus made a universal dictate, that we are off a month. But this isn't accurate. And that's the reason it's the precession that I mentioned. Because at the time of Christ, and at the time that Josephus wrote, because of precession, the sun was in Aries in early April. So I'm going to show that. So if we go to my speculative date for the resurrection of 31, and you can see that at this point, the sun is already past Aries. It's in Taurus. So we go back to when Nisan may have begun, sometime early April, and you can see that the sun is in Aries. So if we move forward a month, again, the sun is way past Aries. So the point I'm making is that what Josephus says in his quotation, it's completely accurate. At the time that he wrote it, the sun would be in Aries around the time of Passover, pretty much in any year. Even if you went to March, you could still make the argument that the sun was in Aries at the time that Josephus wrote. So, or at the time, Christ would have been crucified, and at the time that Josephus wrote, because precession is such a slow process that the sky would look virtually unaltered, even over that 40-year span of time, from the time Jesus died to when Josephus recorded what he said. However, over centuries and centuries, the angle changes quite a bit. So it affects where the sun appears to be along the ecliptic in the sky at that time of year. So long story short, don't factor that in terms of the calendar. It doesn't affect when the year starts. The year still starts when it should start. So again, the rabbinical calendar suggests that the first new moon after the equinox is not necessarily the first new moon of the year, or where the month begins. They believe that it's the new moon that's closest to the equinox, whether it be on a date that's before the equinox or after the equinox. But in 70% of years, it doesn't matter, because the new moon that's closest to the equinox is after the equinox. And then in this observed calendar that we've discussed, we suggest that the new moon that's after the equinox should always start the month in every year, so that the month of Abib, Nisan, is kept in its season. So this is important. The equinox really is what determines the seasons from a scientific perspective. When light is equalized, or you have equal day and equal night, and more light starts to, wax greater each day as the season progresses, that's spring. That is spring. So regardless of where the sun falls on these constellations, the equinox is still at the same point. It's roughly like March 21st, somewhere in there, 20th, 21st, 22nd, something like that. And that doesn't change. So you can look at going back to the time of Christ, and the equinox would still be the same. So I would argue that the equinox really does determine the season. And that is something that God instituted. It's just kind of a scientific reality that our physical seasons on Earth and our growth cycles are based on the equinoxes. And then the next thing I wanted to mention is the Jubilee, which I talked about in my last video, and how my calendar is not based on the Jubilee. It could very well be compatible with the Jubilee, but I just don't think that's the foundation for a calendar. I feel like we should stick with the days of the week and the sabbatical cycle, which seem to be the unbroken chain from Scripture. But I mentioned two of the ways the Jubilee is calculated. So one of them being, this is sort of like the scholarly perspective, is that it's purely a 49-year cycle. The Jubilee is actually the 7th Shmita year. In other words, the 49th year, which would be a Shmita or a sabbatical year, doubles as the Jubilee. So that's how they view it. And their argument is that if you had 2 years of fallow, there would be starvation in the land. That's basically the idea. But there is a scripture that talks about how God would provide enough fruit for 3 years. So it could be that, the scholarly perspective is really just kind of an issue of, from the secular mind, it's impossible. But if God really did provide them all that they needed, as he did at the time of the famine in Joseph's day, then it does work to have a 50th year truly being the Jubilee or intercalated year. So the second way that you can factor the Jubilee, which I mentioned, is that it's intercalation, where there's the 50th year that follows the Shmita year, the 7th Shmita year. It truly would be a 50th year, and then a new cycle would begin after the Jubilee is over. So that it would basically be 50 years, and then another 50 years, and another 50 years. But there's actually a third way to reckon the Jubilee, and this is actually the method that I suppose in my timeline, and I don't go into great detail, but you might see a few instances where I reference it. And that is kind of a bit of both, so that the Jubilee really is the 50th year, but it's not intercalated, so that the Jubilee also doubles as the first year in a new 7-year cycle. So over a long span of time, using this reckoning, the Sabbath cycle is unbroken. You still can count by Shmitas throughout history. And that's kind of what we see happening in Daniel 9, where it seems to be an unbroken count of Shmitas. And Daniel 9 doesn't seem to fit with the idea that you'd have a 50th year that's separate from the Shmita cycle before it or the Shmita cycle that follows it. But in the reckoning, I'm kind of persuaded by at the moment, after the final Shmita year, which is the 49th year, the next year is both the first year of a 7-year cycle and it is the Jubilee. So that's kind of the perspective that I take. But I'm not super persuaded by really either of the three. I'm kind of on the fence between them. And the reason is that there was debate even at the time of Christ, and there still is debate today. So if anybody says they've got it figured out, I tend to doubt that. But I know what I'm more persuaded by. And then someone mentioned the days of the week and the days of the month and the lunar cycle and how they should align. So I talked about that in detail in my last video, but I can just briefly retouch on that. I think it's important that you cannot have a calendar where the first day of the month always is the same day of the days of the week as in every other month. In other words, you can't always have a calendar where day one is Sunday, for instance, because then you would have incomplete weeks virtually every month of the year. So that just doesn't work. And so that's not how they kept it at the time of Christ. There's no historical support for that whatsoever. It just doesn't work. And I think that's important that we keep that in mind. So it is true that some of the festivals, fall on a full moon, but that doesn't have anything to do with the days of the week. So Passover doesn't always have to happen on a particular day of the week, like Friday or Saturday. It can float through the days of the week. And in so doing, you can have a consistent lunar calendar, and the days of the month don't equal the days of the week. So days of the week can float through the days of the month. All right, so the next comment pertained to my Thursday crucifixion speculation. Just want to say I could be wrong about this. This is my leaning at the time. And as it turns out, the argument can be made for a Wednesday or a Thursday crucifixion in the year 31. So either could arguably work. But here's some of my basic reasoning for, again, not subscribing to the Wednesday crucifixion theory that's popular online. So just look at this little chart that I made. This first row here shows Friday, and then the second row here shows Thursday, and then Wednesday is down here. And scholars tend to subscribe to the Friday theory because of the frequent mention of the preparation day. And also because many times it says that Jesus rose on the third day. So Friday works pretty well with the many times it says he rose on the third day. But it doesn't fit well with the 3 days and 3 nights that Jesus mentions. So there's some interesting ways people try to get around that with Friday, but I don't see how, really. So a lot of times scholars will fall back on Jesus' mention of the sign of Jonah, 3 days and 3 nights, would just be idiomatic. And I don't want to completely dismiss that. There's some arguments people make for that, but I don't see any way that if Jesus was literal about 3 days and 3 nights, how Friday can work with that. Because with Jewish reckoning, where it's about touching any part of a day, when you count the days, you'd have Friday night, because again, he was crucified before sunset, before the new day began, but he also was buried before sunset. They had to get him buried before preparation day. So Friday night, Saturday night, and then he rose before dawn on Sunday. So, but again, that would have been part of the same day, and there was no light yet. So you couldn't count Sunday because he rose before dawn. So Friday night, Saturday night. That's really 2 days and 2 nights by Jewish reckoning in my mind. But the Friday crucifixion does fit well with the third day, that he would rise on the third day, because you have Friday, Saturday, and then you could say Sunday, but even that's a little bit weak. But you could make the argument that he rose on the third day with the Friday crucifixion. Thursday, to me, just fits beautifully for both. So you'd count Thursday when he died and was buried, Thursday night, Friday night, and then Saturday night. That's 3 days and 3 nights by Jewish reckoning. And what's cool about a Thursday crucifixion is that it also reconciles all the many passages that say he rose on the third day. So you could count Thursday, and then Friday night, and then Saturday. Those are the days that he was buried. And then he was risen before dawn on Sunday. So 3 days. On the third day, he rose again. And with Wednesday, to me, it's much harder to reconcile on the third day. I don't really see how you do it. He would have been crucified and buried on Wednesday before the sunset. So Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night. That's 4 days and 4 nights by Jewish reckoning. And then he technically rose the next day before dawn. So really hard to make that argument that he rose on the third day with a Wednesday crucifixion. And it would also be a little bit awkward. And people have done some gymnastics here, but you'd have Wednesday, and then that was also a preparation day. And then the next day would have been the festival. And then Friday would have been sort of, this in between before the weekly Sabbath. So it's harder to reconcile some of the passages in scripture about the crucifixion account and the burial with Wednesday in my mind. But I know there's some clever arguments out there that I've read, not persuaded by them, but this is kind of where I stand. I think that Thursday is our best bet. But Friday could be correct if Jesus was being idiomatic about 3 days and 3 nights. And I say that because there are many passages that say that the crucifixion occurred on preparation day, and that terminology preparation day is historically only connected with the day before the weekly Sabbath. So people will say that a high holy day, the day before, would be called preparation day, but we don't really have quotes saying that that's the case. And it makes sense, and I think it could fit, but we don't really have historical support for that. So I think there is still a strong argument for Friday, believe it or not. But I personally subscribe to Thursday. I think that fits. And interestingly enough, in 31 AD, a Wednesday or Thursday crucifixion would fit pretty well. And I've seen arguments for either of those days in 31 AD. So that year, it kind of could go either way. All right. And so lastly, for this video, I wanted to touch on the Enoch calendar that folks bring up, and the Jubilees calendar, and why we should be relying on those calendars. So I don't subscribe to it. I know it's been popularized. Dr. Ken Johnson, he's a brilliant guy, and I've read a lot of his stuff. He's great. He's kind of popularized the Enoch calendar, but I don't subscribe to it. So the problem with the Enoch and Jubilees calendar, both of which are similar, is that they propose a 364-day year where you would have 12 months of 30 days each. So each month is the same. And then you'd have these 4 intercalated days throughout the year, so that you'd have a total of 364 days in a year. So the Jubilees and Enoch calendar, I believe both have that 364-day year. The problem is that does not align with the seasons whatsoever. Within like 30 days or something, within about 29 years, it would be off a whole month. And then another 29 years, it'd be off a whole month. It just doesn't align with the seasons at all. And there's no mention of a method to get it to align with the seasons in the text. So you have to concoct some kind of wild theories about how the Enoch calendar would add like a week after a certain period of time that's not mentioned in the text, or add, an extra month after 29 years or whatever it is. Same with the Jubilees calendar. So, and this is not to poo-poo like the Book of Enoch. I've studied it. I think it's worth studying. It is clear that Jude quotes from Enoch, but I think it's important that we not put all of our eggs in the Enoch calendar basket. It doesn't fit with the seasons. There's no explanation for why. And moreover, the Enoch calendar is not lunar. It's not a lunar calendar. 30-day months do not fit with the lunar calendar at all. The days in the lunar month are, roughly 29 or so. And a 30-day calendar would mean that the cycles of the moon have nothing to do with the days of the month. But in the Bible, we know that the month is what determines, or we know that the moon is what determines the month. And in fact, the word Kodesh in Hebrew, it means new moon, also means month. It means either way. So their month was so closely associated with the new moon in their mind, and they definitely subscribe to a lunar calendar, and all the historical evidence that we have supports that. So for that reason, I kind of wanted to touch on the Dead Sea Scrolls that come up a lot, and the apocryphal books. I totally think that they're worth studying, but we still need to have a distinction between apocryphal works and scripture itself. There is a reason that apocryphal books are not in the canon. And it's not just because Constantine determined the canon. That's historically false. People say that. The canon of the New Testament was pretty much solidified by the late 2nd century. And there was never an attempt to add Enoch or some of those books into the canon. They were always understood to be not quite worthy to be in the canon. And so for a long time, the only version of Enoch that we had was Ethiopic. And we knew that it was written probably centuries after Christ. And then with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found Aramaic fragments. So I think they would have been like Samaritan, that had a good portion of the book. And that was revolutionary because it means that we knew the book of Enoch was written before Christ, at least a couple centuries before Christ. And that is amazing. And I think there's a lot in the book of Enoch that points to Christ. So why is that? I think that we kind of have to understand that the book of Enoch has shown a substantial amount of redaction. So we don't really know what the original book looked like. And separately, there was fragments found from what's called the Book of Giants in the Dead Sea Scrolls that may have been part of an original book of Enoch. It's very similar in what it talks about. And it was, at least the fragments that we have were probably written around the same time as the manuscripts of Enoch that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So my personal belief is that Enoch has some truth in it from God, but there's so much redaction we don't exactly know. Like, we know that the part that Jude quotes is God breathed and ordained, but there's so much that is clearly redaction that we can't just take the whole thing. And I would argue that probably there's a lot in Enoch that is from Jewish oral traditions that were passed down over time from, way back when, that may have come from documents that were written, before the exile. And those could have been taken from, private collections from the patriarchs, who themselves may have gotten it from Noah, who would have gotten it from Enoch. I mean, you can make the argument. It seems possible. And since Jude quotes from it, I do give it weight. Definitely give it weight, but I would definitely not suggest that all of Enoch is God breathed. To me, there's a lot of evidence that it's not all God breathed, and we have to be kind of cautious with that. And it's important to point out that the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls were not all super aligned to the view that Scripture is something that we should just pass down unaltered to the next generation. They did not always subscribe to that. We have kind of this view in our mind that the Essenes and the scribes at Qumran were, had great allegiance to every jot and tittle. And some did, for sure. We have some amazing discoveries from the Dead Sea Scrolls that confirm the Bibles that we have, but they had sort of a genre of literature where pseudepigraphy was very popular, and revisionism of biblical history. But that's kind of like Jubilees. The book of Jubilees is very much revising and reordering things from the biblical account. And that's something that they did fairly often. So the Psalms, for instance, that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls are completely reordered from the Jewish tradition. And so a lot of times the scribes were putting things together, adding things to fit a narrative. And in Jubilees, for instance, the narrative is that we've subscribed to this false pagan calendar that's lunar, and we should have a solar calendar. So the Enoch Jubilees calendar is more solar than lunar. And honestly, that comes from not biblical tradition, but Egyptian or Babylonian tradition. So I would not give much weight to the Enoch calendar. Also, with the Enoch calendar, there are 2,912 days mentioned over a span of 8 years. And if you divide that out, that's 364 days a year, like I discussed, 364-day calendar. But that shows no evidence of any intercalation in that time. So, their seasons will be off by like 8 days over that span. And that just doesn't fit with the Bible or with the seasons that we see with our own eyes. So, well, I hope that was informative and helpful in adding some new light to my calendar that I talked about in my last video, and addressing some of the comments and questions that came up from that last video. So again, this is my speculation and my opinion. I could be wrong. And you know what? It doesn't matter because these things are not essential things. So I love seeing in the body when we have an iron sharpening iron discussion and we learn from each other, we glean from each other, we hold each other up and edify each other. We don't tear one another down over completely non-essential things. They're important things, but they're not essential things. And there's a major distinction between what's essential and what is important, but not essential. So I just love that about this community and all of you that are watching with me, that we can look together and we don't have to agree on every detail, but we agree on the things that really matter. And we agree on most of the details as well. So that's such a blessing. I love you all, and Maranatha.